Thank you so much, Lori. Biogeography is the crossroads between biology, geography, and history. And it first entered my life in 1963 when I was a small lad, opening the pages of The Guardian, which I read every day, and I saw this picture, or perhaps one like it, and that was my first connection, groping connection towards biogeography. What had happened, reported in the pages of The Guardian and other media around the world, was a brand new island had exploded out of the sea, way, way off in remote, exotic Iceland. So that's how the news coverage started. But the news coverage, the media coverage, within a couple of years quickly turned away from the explosive pictures of the drama of the volcano to new life appearing on this island. There were plants, there were animals, and there was even a research station that had sprouted up on this island. Circe had become a laboratory of biogeography. So biogeography is about, when it has to do with islands, is about how plants and animals get to islands and how they stick around on those islands, or perhaps sometimes they don't. So there's various ways that plants and animals can get to islands. If you're a bird with wings and you're flighted bird, you just fly there, that's easy. If you're a plant seed, you may be blown by the wind, or you may stick on mud attached to the feet of birds. If you're a mammal, other than a swimming mammal like a seal or whale, it's a little bit harder. You may be able to swim, depending on your swimming prowess. You might find yourself on a log that drifts out to sea. If you're really lucky, that log will take you to a place where you can get off and dry yourself out, and that would be your new home. If you're in a place that's cold enough and there's ice in the winter, you can travel on foot by ice bridge. And finally, if you're thinking over the long stretch of time when sea levels were lower during the history of the Earth, you might be able to travel to what would become an island over the land bridge of dry land, formerly seafloor. So, island biogeography has very long roots in biology, going back to Darwin and Wallace's day, but it came into its own as a quantitative modern science in 1967 with the publication of this paper by the American ecologists Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. And they started off with some common sense suppositions, such as this one. If you consider the creatures that might venture forth on a log, or by swimming, or by some process like that, as propagules, seeking a location for them to colonize and settle, and if that process is random in direction and time, if you have a fairly large island close to the mainland shore, you probably have a reasonably good chance that one of these propagules will come along and settle on your island. And of course, to establish an ongoing population, you either need a male or female, or you need a pregnant female. The contrasting situation is a small island, much farther away, and this the same spreading pattern of propagules going off into the ocean would lead to a much lower chance of any of them actually reaching the island and colonizing it. So what MacArthur Wilson did was put a quantitative stamp on these processes, mathematical formulas, which they tested with data from very large data sets of islands around the world. And they posited with the creation of their formulas and tested with the testing of the formulas that colonization rate has a curve like this and produces a number of species that you see on the x-axis. And if the island is large, you'll have a higher colonization rate than if the island is small, for the reason that we just saw. But an additional part of their analysis is something a little bit less intuitively obvious. The number of species on an island depends not only on the number of species that reach it, but the extinction rate of those species. Because going to a new island, it may not be a very hospitable place. And if you start out with, say, one male and one female, if you have like a really bad weather situation the first 2 days, or you arrive really hungry and emaciated, well, you may not survive, and that colonization effort may be short-lived. So extinction is part of the equation. So their basic biogeographic island equation looks like this. Colonization in red on one side, extinction on the other, and the number of species on any given island, any time, any place and time, is in the equilibrium process between colonization and extinction. So let's now head out into the Atlantic Ocean to see how these concepts apply. And we're going to deal with mammals, because there's a lot of research on mammals. Number of mammals in most places in the world is well known, it's well documented. So we have something to work on. But of course we have to start with the source of the colonization. The source of the colonization for islands, of course, is continents. The bigger the continent, the more species there are. That's the general rule. So the biggest continent of all in the world is Eurasia. It's also connected to Africa. So you have a very large abundance of species of mammals and all sorts of other things on that very large continent. So we're going to be talking about islands on the east side of the Atlantic, because you have a series of islands, Great Britain and Ireland and Iceland and so on and so forth. More so than you have on the west side, where the islands are very close to the continent, like Newfoundland and PEI. So we're dealing mostly on the east side in this talk. So we need a representative area in the continent of Eurasia to count species as a sort of a baseline, the starting point. And that baseline is France, representative area. France has 55 species of mammal. And we would hypothesize that according to the patterns that we saw in MacArthur and Wilson's theory, that as you go across the English Channel to Great Britain, to Ireland, and the islands further north, that you would have a gradual fall-off in the number of species. However, remember what I said about biogeography off the top. It's biology, it's geography, and it's history. You can't forget the history. So let's go back in history a little bit. Let's go back in history between 10,000 and 25,000 years ago. It was a period of glacial maximum of the ice sheet that covered most of the northern hemisphere. So at that time, everything you see in the pale sort of veil over the land was covered with ice 1 to several kilometers thick, erasing all life underneath it. So that means that you had to wait for that ice to disappear before you could have colonization events. That's the first part of the ice story. The second part of the ice story is that that ice took up so much water from the world's oceans that it dried up the seas around the edges of continents, dried up continental shelves. And that produced a land bridge. So the brown area here, it was the part of the North Sea, the English Channel, the Irish Sea, which was dry land during the period immediately after the last glacial advance turned around and retreated. So there was a land bridge. This map is dated 7000 BC, so that land bridge existed at that time and would have existed for some time after that before it was flooded by the rising sea levels. So the upshot of this is that when we talk about the island biogeography of Britain and Ireland, it's actually a misnomer, because what are now those two islands were not islands when they received most of their species. So it wasn't really island biogeography at all. Nevertheless, we will soldier on and we will count the species in Britain and count the species in Ireland. So in France, on the mainland, you have 55 species of mammal, Britain 39 species, Ireland 16 species. So you do have that downward progression of the number of species. But you can't just attribute it to island biogeographic theory because of the land bridge effect. But there are other ecological reasons why you see that pattern. One is that the farther you go north, far north in the globe and far south in the globe, the fewer species you have. The tropics has the greatest diversity of species. High latitudes have a lower diversity. So you're seeing some of that effect here. Also, it's likely that some of the species that wanted to get to Britain and Ireland, perhaps species that are more southerly adapted, at the time the land bridge still existed, the climates of those areas would be too cold and they would not have reached those islands, what became islands, before the land bridge disappeared and the channels flooded. So now we are going to go further north yet. 3 sets of islands, archipelagos, between Scotland and Iceland. The first is the Orkneys, then the Shetlands, and then the Faroes. The Orkneys and Shetlands, of course, are part of the United Kingdom. The Faroes are a self-governing territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. So let's take a closer look at those 3 locations. First of all, the Shetlands and the Orkneys. These are north, they are remote, but they're surprisingly pastoral. In some landscapes in the Orkneys and Shetlands, you can almost think that you were on Prince Edward Island if you look the other way, away from the direction of very tall and towering sea cliffs, seabird cliffs. There are not a lot of trees, but they are quite agricultural. The soil is good and it's fertile. If you go further north to the Faroes, the islands have a different character. They're very high, very rugged, basically a high plateau with steep slopes down to the sea. And they're absolutely grand and absolutely beautiful. Faroes are an absolutely wonderful, wonderful place to visit, absolutely eye-catching. So, native mammals, not including bats, we're always forgetting about the bats, which could fly to these places. Orkneys 0, Shetlands 0, Faroes 0. Now, of these 3 sets of islands, the Orkneys had a land bridge. They could have received species from the mainland of Britain on dry land, but they didn't. Shetlands and the Faroes, we come up with 0 species of mammals. So those are the numbers at the present time. It does not exclude the possibility that mammals had colonized those islands previously, but their the stay of the species was short-lived because extinctions, especially on small islands, are a constant possibility. There is an interesting aside to the mammals of the Orkney Islands. There's a little critter called the Orkney vole. A vole is something like a mouse. The Orkney vole is not a native species, not a native mammal to the Orkneys because there are none. It arrived with Stone Age farmers from Europe about 3,000 years ago, actually 3000 BC, which means 5,000 years ago. And as soon as it got there, it started to set its own evolutionary course. Its tooth patterns changed, dentition changed, and then it started growing bigger. Nobody really understands why. But this little mouse is not as little, not nearly as little as its distant cousins way back on the European continent. So the mouse biologists now call the Orkney vole a subspecies. It's not a fully different species, but it is a different subspecies. It's genetically different enough from the mainland species, the regular mainland species back home in Europe, that it has this different character. And this points to the value of islands in the history of biology, the history of understanding the basics, some of the most fundamental parts of how life works on Europe. We've all heard of Charles Darwin. We've all heard that Charles Darwin's favorite haunt and his most influential location that he visited was the Galapagos Islands. So one thing that Darwin and his helpers did when he was on the Galapagos Islands, this is the 1830s, he collected a bunch of finches. We know finches, sparrows are in the finch group. They have big, heavy, thick bills. Big, heavy, thick bills because they need those heavy, thick bills to crush seeds. And he noticed that their birds were clearly finches by various characteristics that they had. But some of them had big, heavy, finch-like bills. Others had little, small, pointing bills, almost like warblers that just go grab little insects. So why would a finch have a warbler-like bill? So from those observations, and also from information on the various kinds of fish species that were available from the South American continent, it was possible to deduce that all of these finch species on the Galapagos Islands had descended from one species of ancestral finch that something like 1 million years ago crossed over and by some accident flew the, I think, like 800 kilometers off the coast of South America, landing on the Galapagos Islands. And then its descendants radiated, adaptive radiation is what it's called, into all these different forms. And the realization of what was going on there, in Darwin's mind, after a lot of thinking, a lot of study, and working in museums and so on, broke down the basic concept that he and everybody else had that time, which was that species are immutable. Once a species, always a species. Species don't arrive in the world, they don't depart from the world, they're just there. So here was a case where an invading bird from a different place came, and in order to fill the ecological niches that were vacant, that pair of birds' descendants became all of these different species, some specializing in insects, some specializing in large seeds, small seeds, and so on and so forth. So, if we talk about the Orkney vole, way up in the Atlantic Ocean, it's sort of an echo of what was going on there. If you came back to the Orkney Islands in 1 million years' time, maybe the Orkney Islands would have a dozen species of voles, all specialized in different ways of being a vole. So let us move on now to Iceland. Iceland, I think, how many here have been to Iceland? Yes. Well, Iceland is worth going to. So Iceland is volcanic, it's rugged, it has the famous black sandy beaches, it has more waterfalls than you can shake a stick at, it has farms nestled under high mountains. And how many mammals does it have? How many native mammals does it have? Anybody know? It has one, and it's the Arctic fox. So, there's a series of smaller islands north of Iceland that you've probably never heard of. You have Maine, Bear Island, and they have one species of mammal, Arctic fox. So what's that all about? In a word, it's about ice. The Arctic fox is famous for going out on sea ice, does not fear going out on ice far off land, and especially likes following after polar bears, picking up scavenged remains. So, the Arctic fox got to all of these islands by traveling over sea ice. That is quite clear. Iceland, at the present time, has very little sea ice. It is very rare to have sea ice at all around Iceland. All it takes is one pregnant female on one particularly cold year, and all of a sudden you've got a population of Arctic foxes. There's one set of islands even further north called Svalbard. The term Spitsbergen might be more familiar to you. Spitsbergen is one of the islands in the Svalbard chain. And it is very, very high, Arctic, very, very far. The same latitude as the top of Greenland. It has two mammal species, the Arctic fox, of course, and reindeer. Reindeer, same species as caribou, and reindeer or caribou, they don't mind walking over ice at all. Sometimes they'll even swim. So it's clear how both of those species got to Svalbard. Shifting to the west now to Greenland. So Greenland is well connected by ice to the west, connected to northern Canada. Northern Canada is connected to southern Canada. So it's easy to imagine the route that mammals would have taken to get to Greenland. So that Greenland has 7 species of mammal, which reflects the greater ease of access from the seed source, the transit routes. But also Greenland has very large latitudinal range from very high up to quite far south. So that means it has a greater range of habitats to accommodate a greater range of species. So we talked about plants and animals, and particularly mammals. How about people? So how do we get our islands populated with human beings? Well, first of all, we have the Ice Age to deal with. So the Ice Age left about 10,000 years ago, and left also a land bridge. So when that happened, human beings crossed that land bridge and got to England. And of course they would not realize that they were crossing a land bridge. They would say, well, we're just crossing land. However, those were not the first people to arrive in England and in Great Britain, because the Ice Ages lasted about 2.6 million years, but it was not one giant event, ice, and then constant ice, and then no ice. It was ice advancing, then retreating, advancing, then retreating, several times. So we talk about glacial maxima and glacial minima. So the veil over this map shows the glacial maxima, but more than 26,000 years ago, prior to this, there was the glacial minimum. At the time, that glacier was not there, and there are clear remains in what is now the United Kingdom that people occupied that territory, occupied that land. But of course, the ice advanced, they had to scamper out of there. And this is what it's conjectured that they look like. So when did people arrive in those northern islands? The Orkneys are the basis of scattered pottery shards. The evidence is not all that clear, and it's rather scant, but archaeologists who works the Orkneys assured me, yes, we firmly believe that that human beings were in the Orkneys about 8000 BC. Shetlands a little bit later. Faroes at that time, not at all. So the migrants that reached the Orkneys and the Shetlands became part of a very large cultural tradition that was dominant in the British Isles about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And these were the folks that built Stonehenge that we've all heard of. But there are many, many other monument rings in the British Isles that you probably haven't heard of, including something called the Ring of Brodgar, the Orkney Islands. So clearly these people were moving back and forth, maintaining cultural contact, probably speaking the same language. Shetlands were part of this network as well. So how about the Faroes? Well, they just didn't get populated this time, not until later. What seems to have been going on was kind of obvious when you think about it. If you're standing on a hill, the northern end of Scotland, even at sea level, you can see the Orkney Islands. It's not very far. You're standing on a hill in the Orkney Islands, you can see the Shetlands. It's not that far. So you go where you can see. If you stand on a hill in the Shetlands and you look north and west, all you see is water. It's too far. You cannot see the Faroes, even though the Faroes are high and mountainous. So the Shetlands and the Orkneys got colonized very early. The Faroes did not. So how did they get there? Land bridges don't explain everything. These people must have had boats. And this is something that very little is known about. The world's earliest known boat was dug out of a bog in the Netherlands a number of years ago. It's called the Pessy dugout canoe. It was made of a single log of oak, hollowed out, and it's about 10,000 years old. So, first known boat, certainly there were boats before that. Boats must have been used a lot at that time and a lot before that time, but nothing has been preserved. It's hard to think that a dugout canoe could be scaled up to the size of a vessel that you would need to transit those waters over the open ocean from Scotland to the Orkneys to the Shetlands. I would not like to paddle a dugout canoe like 50 or 75 miles of open water. Replica leather boat. So this is a technology that we know existed later. We'll see an example a couple of slides hence. So that is the kind of craft with wooden frame with leather stretched over it. That's the kind of craft that can be scaled up to a larger size. And it has indeed been done in many cultural traditions around the world, including, for example, the Umiak, which was sort of the workhorse boat of the Inuit people in the Arctic. So what we do know, with a great deal of certainty because of oral tradition, because of written records, and because of archaeology, that around the year 800, the Vikings, by that time, had become very, very good boat builders. And around that year, around 800, they sort of exploded out of southern Scandinavia in all directions, including west, southwest, and northwest, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and the Faroes. So in the case of the Shetlands and Orkneys, they arrived to places which were already populated. They just turned up. They would have taken the best land and the best resources, but then they settled down, and after a few generations they became part of the normal local population. But nevertheless, despite their integration into the local society, the Viking influence and the heritage and culture in those islands, especially the Shetlands, is still very strong, and there's a strong identity, cultural identity, to the Viking thread of their ancestry. So they also settled the Faroes around the year 800, and that was perhaps an easier thing to do because no one lived there at the time. But that doesn't mean that no one had been there earlier. There are ongoing controversies as to whether the Vikings were the first to reach the Faroes. In the middle of the first millennium, like something around the year 500, we know that there was a tradition of Irish monks, including the famous St. Brendan, to put to sea in leather boats, leather stretched over wooden frames. So they went off to sea, but we really don't know where they went. But we do know that boats of that design could be quite seaworthy, because in the 1970s, an English adventurer named Tim Severin built a boat out of leather, wood frame and leather, and he sailed it from Ireland up around to Iceland and then all the way to Newfoundland. He sailed across the Atlantic in a leather boat. So that proves that these boats were at least potentially seaworthy enough to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean. But of course, it doesn't prove that they actually did. There's another source which is, lends some degree of credence to the idea that these monks, Irish monks, did sail quite far distances into the Atlantic Ocean. There was an Irish monk writing in the year 825 AD, and he said, "There is another set of islands separated by narrow stretches of water. In these, for nearly 100 years, hermits from Ireland have lived." And that is a description which suits to a T the Faroe Islands. Islands separated by narrow stretches of water. But there's a lot of debate about that passage. It could be some of the islands in western Scotland. Other ways to sort of explain it away, because you don't really know exactly when it was written down and who wrote it and so on and so forth. However, in 2021, a paper appeared in the scholarly literature which put a much higher degree of plausibility on the Irish monk theory. What these people did is they went to a pond on the Faroe Islands and they made a core sample at the bottom of the pond, dredged up the bottom. And this is a common method in biology to try to recreate history, plant history. You look for pollen and so on, see if there were trees, or what species of trees, what species of grass and whatnot. But they found something I don't think that they were expecting at all. They found remnants, or residues, of sheep dung at the bottom of this pond. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that somebody brought sheep to the Faroe Islands. They certainly didn't get there by themselves. It doesn't necessarily mean that the sheep were there 500, that people were there 500 years after the birth of Christ, because if the people had arrived, they had disappeared, the sheep probably would have been let go. They would have continued as wild sheep. Nevertheless, we have the theory of the Irish monks, and this sheep dung evidence is really strong, supporting that direction. For Iceland, the colonization by Vikings is quite clearly documented in archaeology, and also by written records. They were written quite a few years, many years, in fact several centuries after the actual event, based on oral tradition. But the story of the Viking colonization of Iceland from these various sources, it all hangs together and it's coherent, and it is credible. So within a few decades, there were enough Vikings, enough Norse coming from Scandinavia, that just about every scrap of arable land in Iceland had a sod hut on it. So that early documentation of that settlement includes an intriguing passage. Before Iceland was peopled from Norway, they were in it papar. So papar was a term, it's related to the word pope. It's a term that the Norse used to refer to Irish monks. There were in it papar, they were found left by them Irish books, bells, and croziers. And this is from Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements. So that clearly refers to the Irish monks coming to Iceland sometime well before the Vikings, not being there at the time the Vikings arrived, but leaving their relics and artifacts behind. However, there are always alternate explanations that can be made when you don't really know who wrote stuff down, when the person writing stuff down is depending on oral tradition. The oral tradition could have been buried, the stories could have been changed with time and embellished with the telling over the more than, probably in the order of 150, 200 years. So it's not a lock that the Irish monks first colonized Iceland. It is plausible. And what it would take would be firm archaeological evidence of their presence, and a lot of people have looked but have not found. So we talk about extinction as part of the biogeographic story. If you want to continue the population that you've established on an island, is it a good idea to send a batch of celibate monks? Is that a winning strategy? Or could that just lead to extinction? That may be part of the story here. The Faroes and Iceland. If they just sent the wrong kind of demographic package, those propagules would not propagate. Okay, we have more islands further north that we have to deal with. Jan Mayen, Bear Island, Svalbard. And these islands were discovered first by Europeans with big sailing ships. Time of the Renaissance. It took that kind of technology to get that far north and that far away from any kind of home base. We will shift further west, and now we will talk about Greenland, which has a very different history, of course, because the original colonization came from the west, came from people of Asian origin rather than European origin. And here we have two ethnic groups. The first, which we call on this slide Sakak. They go by a number of different names. Instead of confusing you with all these names, I will refer to them solely by this Sakak designation. So they arrived about 3,500 BC and spread around Greenland, or all around the coast of Greenland, and they sort of waxed and waned. There seemed to have been periods where the archaeologists could find no records of them, but then they would turn up again. So it seems like they were having local extinctions, but then probably bad years or heavy ice or just bad conditions, bad luck, but then areas would be repopulated again. But they hung in there. They're there for nearly 4,000 years until approximately the year 1200. Well, the year 1200, an entirely different group of indigenous people arrived from Asia. These were called Inuit, and they are the ancestors of today's Inuit people. They had dogs, dog sleds, They had better technology. They had bows and arrows. And they had all of these advanced techniques that the Sakak people did not. And within 100 years, the Sakak people disappeared from the face of the earth, leaving no descendants. So that's on the Asian and indigenous side. How about the European side? We all know that the Vikings turned up in Greenland just before the year 1000, a few years before the year 1000. They also went on to Newfoundland, but briefly. Possibly Prince Edward Island, no. So the Vikings were there for something over 400 years, and they disappeared in the early 1400s. It's hard to say whether they became extinct because maybe they died out, or maybe some of the last ones just took boats back to Iceland. So we wouldn't use the word extinct. But anyway, there were no Europeans in Greenland for about 300 years, and then in the 1700s, other Scandinavians, this time Danes, came back, and they established settlements and colonies. So at the present time, the population of Greenland is about 80%, 85% of Inuit descent, and with the remainder mostly Scandinavians originally from Denmark. So if you look at the timeline here, you find an anomalous situation in that the Europeans who live in Greenland trace their ancestry to European arrivals that actually preceded the arrival of indigenous people. That's a little bit odd because usually you think, well, the indigenous people arrived first, that's why they're indigenous. But no, the Europeans actually arrived in Greenland before the Inuit did. The information we have can be summed up, I think, in the next several slides. And here we'll go a little bit further on the North American side, which we haven't really touched on very much, other than Greenland itself. So, coming from the west, we have an indigenous expansion. These people, of course, were of Asian origin originally. And the blue line, in what is in Greenland, and also what is now Nunavut, represents the furthest expansion of the Sakak people, which was basically Greenland and Nunavut. Further south, Labrador, Quebec, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, what is now the 10 provinces of Canada. There's clear and firm evidence that what we would call the First Nations people were present in that area by 10,000 years ago. Now, they may well have been present much earlier, depending on the availability of open land with the waxing and waning of the ice. There's certainly evidence that indigenous people were on the North American continent much earlier. But to be firm and conservative, we could say 8,000 years BC, indigenous people would have occupied all of eastern Canada, except for one spot that, as far as anybody knows, they didn't get to, which is Sable Island, just too far away. These people were very maritime. They had great canoes. They could travel long distances over open water, travel between Cape Breton Island and Newfoundland. But Sable Island's a long way off, and there was no reason to go there because you didn't know that there was anything there to go to. So that's on the west side. On the European side, you have a line, 4000 BC. That would be early Europeans heading out to sea, but not very far. This is kind of the low-hanging fruit islands, which are quite close to the land. Perhaps your boats aren't that great. You can go out there. Ah, there's a boat. We have a boat. We have the land just over there. We'll paddle out, row out, sail out, and we'll get there. The next stage would be the Irish monks, who were great seafarers. There's a pretty good chance that they reached the Faroe Islands. The next stage after that, 870, the Vikings with their great ocean-going vessels reaching Iceland. After that, 1600, we're now in the Renaissance with big galleons, quite robust and quite seaworthy decked in vessels going far north, discovering the northern islands, and of course also blundering into Sable Island. This was the period of time when Sable Island was first encountered by human beings. Okay. So we are going now to circle back, before we close, to Surtsey Island, where we started. So I took these pictures of Surtsey Island in July of 2023. It's still pretty rocky, because everything in Iceland is pretty rocky, but you do have some green on it. So what's that about? Well, the biogeographic studies on Surtsey Island have mostly concentrated on plants, because that's the thing that's there to study. So, from the beginning, in the early 1960s, the number of vascular plant species has steadily grown to where it is now. Or is it really steady? If you look more carefully, there's actually a plateau in the curve. A period of time when the number of species was stagnant, not increasing. So what's that about? That is about seals and gulls. Seals and gulls at that time started breeding on the island. They would go and feed, and then they would come back on to their colonies and fertilize the ground. And that meant that there was more nutrients for the plants to grow on, and also the birds. More bird traffic meant more chance of seeds from the mainland coming and colonizing the island. So this is kind of a... The Surtsey Island is a laboratory of biogeography. I think the lesson there is that we have these big patterns that MacArthur and Wilson established. And they are valid, and if you have 100 different islands, a large database, and so on, you can do the analysis, and the curves fit, everything matches. But any individual case, you can have local things going on that don't necessarily follow MacArthur and Wilson orthodoxy. And the colonization of this island and what it did to the plant species is an example of that. So there we go. And we will close with a challenge. I will tell you that I took this picture last year. In the Westman Islands, not far from Surtsey. Surtsey is one of the Westman Islands, sort of behind me when I was taking the picture. You see a green island close, and then you see a big dome behind. What is the name of that big dome on the horizon?
Did you get a prize?
Pardon?
Bragging rights.
The big dome behind is called...
Easy for you to say.
That big dome is famous for two things. One, in 2010, a volcano under the glacier exploded, sending clouds of gas and ash over the Atlantic Ocean, disrupting air travel to Europe for weeks. The other thing that it's famous for is that nobody can pronounce its name. Now, we have an Icelandic consul to Prince Edward Island, but I will not ask her because
I'll let somebody else do it.
She's had some practice.
I was taught by an Icelander how to say it. It took me 10 minutes, but yeah, I finally got it.
Can you say it now?
No,
Okay, so
it's up to you guys. Try.
So let's make things a little bit easier. First of all, you break it down into constituent words: island, mountain, glacier. And you remember that in many European languages, including Icelandic, J's are pronounced like Y's. So let's all say the first word together. Aya. Let's say the second word together. Yala. Third word. Now, I'm sure that is not how an Icelander would say it, but it would be how an English person, Anglophone, would say, would give the... So it's not properly pronounced, but it is pronounced. So it's not as fearsome as you might imagine. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
So this is the portion of the evening where, if David is willing, that people can ask questions. And David will respond as best he can. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Over here.
Yes?
Is that a house up there on the outcropping, and is that a fishing boat below in the water?
Just coming out of the harbor at Hymenay, which is the main town, the only town really. So that would be somebody's summer house. Yeah, a lot of land on Iceland is privately owned, and people will set up summer cottages. Now that island is very precipitous. There would not be I'm not sure how you get on that island, get to that house. As for the boat, it's probably a fishing boat. There's a pilot boat service to get you into that harbor, but it looks kind of like the pilot boat, but I don't think the pilot boat would be out that far. I'm not sure.
Is that a set of stairs going up off the shingle beach there? Yeah.
Well, maybe. I'm guessing that it might be a geological structure called a dike, which is kind of a layer of magna that's sort of exposed with erosion. Maybe, I don't know. The picture's not that sharp. It's actually quite a long ways away, so it's a telephoto and it's kind of so that's why it's not a sharp picture.
Is this the island where there was a volcano and people had to evacuate in the middle of the night? Yeah.
Well, not that island, the island that we just left
Yes.
before I took that picture. So the Westman Islands is a set of volcanic islands on the south coast of Iceland. There's a little village on one of them called Hymenay. About 3,000 people live there. And in 1973, the local volcano blew up. And it was in the winter, and there had been stormy weather, and by sheer good fortune, the fishing fleet was all in the harbor because it was too rough to go out. So everybody tore out of their houses down to the harbor and got on the fishing boats and went to safety to land. The volcano, well, you've seen the pictures in Iceland, you know, the lava just comes up out of the ground and sort of flows along. It's rock, it's kind of oozy, messy black rock at several thousand degrees Celsius, and it just oozes along. And it obliterated part of the town, but most of the town was not affected. So after a few months, things sort of settled down. The volcano sort of went back to sleep, and everybody went back to their houses. I'm not sure if I would sleep so well like that under those circumstances, but in Iceland, that's what you do. Oh, just another volcano.
And then it actually improved the harbor, apparently. It made it more, the way that the lava went, it improved it. It made it safer.
Safer harbor, yeah.
Yeah.
More protected.
One of the obvious things, David, of all the pictures of all the islands is the lack of trees. Were there ever trees there, and people, like they always do, cut them down? And what's the history of trees?
The history of trees is that there were trees, not tall trees. There were birches, but of some, maybe 4 or 5 inches in diameter here and there in the sheltered valleys. And the Vikings that came along cut them down, and they used it for construction, and they burnt some of them, and the rest they just cut down for sheep pasture. We think of Iceland as this wonderful progressive place with social welfare and justice and check all the boxes. It's not so widely known that the land of Iceland is actually an ecological disaster, because the method of agriculture that they use with sheep, which nibble very close to the ground, overgrazing over the years, you take off that vegetation, the original tree vegetation, erosion goes crazy, and there are substantial swaths of land in Iceland which were formerly fertile pasture land or cropland, and which now are just bare rock. They don't even grow lichens. It's just absolutely denuded of all soil, and it would take like geological time before soil would rebuild again, like thousands of years before you can grow anything. And that's the ecological history of Iceland. Now, not all areas would have been affected. Areas that would be flat would have much lower erosion rates, but anything on the slopes, you take away the vegetation, you're going to have erosion, and you have that kind of problem. So there are a few places in Iceland where trees have been planted, but a very small fraction of the country has been replanted. So mostly it's bare. If you go to Iceland, they'll tell you the standard joke. If you get lost in an Icelandic forest, what do you do? Stand up. Stand up? Oh, now I can see. Yes?
The horses in Iceland, what is the origin? How did they get there?
They were bought by Vikings. So they are horses, they're not ponies. They are small horses, and they are very numerous. The Icelanders are very proud of their horses. There's a really strong horse culture. The horses are used to round up sheep in the high country in the fall, and riding is a really big thing. The horses are very friendly. They're really nice animals. They're hardy, they're good to ride, they are exported, but no horse can be imported into Iceland because their horses are exempt from diseases that horses have elsewhere in the world. They do not want any chance at all of horse diseases coming into the country. So there is a 100% ban on imported horses. But there is a market for Icelandic horses elsewhere, so there is an export trade.
Do you think there's any connection between Shetland horses and the Icelandic horses? I'm not Shetland.
Shetland ponies, yeah.
Yeah.
I should know that because the lady I was talking to, who you know, that was her PhD, Shetland ponies. I should have quizzed her. I mean, the Shetlands were invaded by Vikings, but I don't know if the ponies, I don't know the genetic origin of the ponies.
They're separate. I do think that, I mean, they're obviously from up top, but I
Yeah.
think they've maybe radiated.
Roughly, I mean, they would be cousins like 1,000 years ago. They would have been cousins because they would have come from the same
So
stock.
the Sable Island ponies would be a completely different breed?
Yes.
Who would the Vikings have brought them then? The Sable Island ponies? No, they came from North America?
They would be some kind of horse that would have come from either Europe or North America. Of course, Europe originally, but
Yeah.
via North America. So I don't know.
Anybody else know? You need some horse experts.
No.
You were talking about some of the stone structures in England there.
Yeah.
Would Stonehenge be around 2,500 years? Was that what you were indicating there, BC?
I think something like that. Yeah.
Was Newgrange in Ireland, did that not precede that by quite a few years, even preceding the pyramids?
Well, the pyramids were constructed over a rather long period of time, and the monument building period in England and British Isles extended over, I'm not sure, 500 years, quite a number of centuries, and that's beyond my knowledge to say which structure came first. Newgrange, certainly in Ireland, would be part of that whole tradition.
How far back did Newgrange, or when do they figure it was constructed? Do you recall?
That I can't remember. I did visit that, and I was very impressed. And you go to England, you think of Stonehenge. Well, then you go all of these places around the country. Well, there's this and there's that and the other. There's a lot of these monuments, not just the big famous one.
So the photograph you opened with, the island sort of rising from the sea,
Yes,
what year did it break the surface?
It was November 1963.
And how large is it today? The portion above the water line?
Well, probably several hundred hectares. Yeah. So that gives you a little bit of sense of scale. Maybe, I don't know, maybe a square kilometer or something like that.
And is it still growing? I mean, there must be volcanic activity there.
No, it's actually shrinking.
Oh.
Some of the volcanic deposition is fairly soft, and wave erosion is actually eroding it. So it has lost a substantial fraction of its area in the last several decades. Just needs another volcano to build it back up.
Is there any life on it other than birds?
Well, you have birds and seals, and you have plants, vascular plants, but there would also be lichens. There have been, I mean, the people who are doing the work there, recording everything. So there would be people doing insects and small ground invertebrates, but I can't say that I've actually read their papers.
It's pretty hard to get there, actually. You have to be a registered scientist, I think, to be able to go.
Oh yes, it's absolutely forbidden unless you have, it's very tightly regulated. And they did this very early on in the game. As soon as it was, cold enough that it was safe to go there, biologists wanted to go there, and the government, wisely said, okay, this is an opportunity to do this biogeography thing. So access was controlled from the very beginning, and still is.
Is there a particular country that lays claim to it?
It's part of Iceland. It's just off the south coast of Iceland, so it's Icelandic.
There's a question back there.
Yeah. I'm just wondering about the chart that you had where the Inuit people came to Greenland and there was already an existing population there.
Yes.
So the genetics of that people have been lost. There was no breeding, like, I don't know if breeding is the right word, but normally when people come in and there's other people there, there's a cross-cultural, relationship so that the genetics of the pre-existing population continue, but we don't think that happened.
Okay, so the genetic profile of the Sackak people has been investigated because they have found remains and have been able to extract DNA fragments.
Right.
And that genetic profile has been compared with modern-day Inuit. And the genetics indicate no match. For Inuit populations in Canada and in Greenland. However, in the western part of North America, the situation seems to be is more muddled, because the ancestors of the certain branches of the Sackak people did interact with other indigenous people in Alaska, perhaps Yukon, and there was some interbreeding, it seems, with those people, so we can't say that the Sackak genetic heritage has been entirely lost. But central and eastern part of the Arctic, studies that have been done so far have not identified any signature of their presence. The Sackak and the Tunit, well, the Sackak and the Inuit had very different cultures, and they did not seem to have interacted at all. The curious thing is that in the oral traditions of the Inuit people, these people are very well known as part of their oral heritage, oral culture. They had a name, they called them the Tunit people, and they were recounted as, as strangers, people that they saw, but they did not have any dealings with them. And just what happened in that 100 years that the two peoples overlapped is not very clear.
Any theories as to why the Sackak died out?
They were, well, if you're an ecologist, you'd say two groups of animals are competing for the same set of resources. The animals that have the better adaptation will win, the animals that have poor adaptation will lose. The Inuit had dogs and dog sleds, which made them much more mobile. They probably had better boats, although that's not terribly clear. They had bows and arrows. The Saca originally had bows and arrows. It's in the archaeological record, but then they stopped using them and they disappeared. They didn't have as good a weapon. Nobody knows why, but they did not have as good a weapon as the Inuit. So they were competing against people who had who were better able to use resources, and if there were battles between, they had better weapons. And that, I'm not aware of any evidence of any physical altercations between the two groups, but that might have happened.
And they came from different parts of Asia originally?
They came from the same part of Asia. Like Asia, like the east end of Asia, Siberia, is like pointed.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
everybody, all indigenous people in North America basically came through that pointed bit of Siberia, but at various times. The people that we call First Nations traditionally were thought to have arrived in North America 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, but that whole timeline is completely upset by work done by actually a colleague in one of my cruises. His archaeology work in New Mexico. What they found was perfectly preserved human footprints in sand, accurately, bang on, firmly dated 22,000 years ago, which really upset the archaeological and anthropological apple cart. Because that's the first time that there's a lot of speculation. But now we know that people were in North America 22,000 years ago. But they kept a very low profile because very little archaeological remains were found until about 10,000 years ago. But they were here. But of course, talking about extinction, maybe they were here, maybe they died out, and other people came in later. There's a lot we don't know.
Any last comments or questions for David?
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. This was so appreciation, which is in our potato bag, and it's a book, and if you have it already, I'll trade it for another one. Or you can give it away as a gift. So thank you again.
Oh, this one.
That one,
yes.
that one. Thank you again.
Yes.
So that will conclude our lecture series for the season. Check out our newsletter when it comes, probably in August. We'll have the schedule for September anyway. If anybody has any ideas for lectures, or you think of somebody that, ooh, I'd love to hear them talk about that, just email me, brinklow@upei.ca. Happy to entertain ideas because we're looking for them. So again, thanks to Mike for videotaping. So the video is going to be on our islandstudies.com website if you want to send it to anybody, probably in the next couple of days, and we'll advertise that in our newsletter too. So safe home, everybody, and thank you again for coming.
This is Rory's presentation on this book. My excuse was that I was in Antarctica.
In Antarctica. He had a pretty darn good excuse.